Welcome, old viewers and new viewers, to another episode of The Dancing Negotiator with Dr. Cheryl Okoli, DHA. This is the show where you learn all about conflict resolution and its strategies. As an example, my original 5 A's of conflict resolution, which you can find on various platforms in the form of my book, Amazons like Canada, United States, and the UK. In addition, morebooks.shop. I realized I kept saying in previous episodes, I kept calling morebooks.shop as more shops. So just for the record, it's actually a platform called morebooks.shop. You can access my book on any one of those platforms that I mentioned. And I also introduce frameworks, evidence-based frameworks, either mine, like I mentioned, or those of other experts in the field in conflict resolution. I like to reserve the third Friday of each month to have a guest. Now, this guest may or may not be an expert in conflict resolution. My apologies, not the last Friday of each month is for a guest who may not be an expert in conflict resolution, but has something of value and salient to either the theme of the month or the topic at hand for that particular episode. The third Friday of each month is reserved for story time. Now, story time is an analysis of a movie, a drama, an event, what went wrong, or what could have been done better. And the story or the movie selected aligns with the theme of the month. So the month of August is all about work-life balance. And I invite you and highly recommend you watch the previous episode if you have not, because we introduce the concept of work-life balance and introduce the Appraisal Plank framework, which was the lens by which we're analyzing work-life balance of an employee. Today, we'll be talking about work-life balance through the lens of the Appraisal Plank, expanding on that plank, but through the lens of a solopreneur or an entrepreneur. Now, did you know there's a difference between the two terms? Did you know that depending on if you're an employee, that your concept of work-life balance might differ from your employer's concept of work-life balance? And just as a refresher, just in case you may not be sure what work-life balance means, because as you know, if you followed me and you know me personally or professionally, I like to define what a term means, either for a topic, an issue, so that everyone that's listening and is involved in the conversation is on the same page, having the same reference point of the topic at hand. So work-life balance, according to an HR expert that I retrieved her work from 2003, a little bit dated, but yet relevant to the topic at hand. She defined work-life balance as a state of equilibrium in which the demands of both a person's job and personal life are equal. Okay, so I am going to be talking about work-life balance, like I mentioned, through the lens of a business owner in this episode. But before I do that, I'd like to talk a little bit about some statistics as it pertains to small businesses here in Canada. Talk a little bit about the seesaw, because when I think about work-life balance, I think about a seesaw, although there's some comparison and contrasts with the imagery of a seesaw. And then we'll talk about the appraisal plank, and then talk about some complex situations that might arise in the work and life of a business owner. And we'll end by providing some call to action steps. So on that note, let's talk a little bit about some statistics about businesses here in Canada. Now, before we do that, let's talk about the difference between the term solopreneur and an entrepreneur. A solopreneur is, as the word implies, one person who owns a business, not just owning the business, but functioning in all operations and capacity of that business. They may or may not perhaps consult with some party to do some work for them, but majority of the time they carry the brunt, the responsibility of that business on their shoulders. According to a resource I found by Apollo 2020, which is actually an insurance company here in Canada, according to their document that I found, they were quoting the government of Canada. I could not find the original source from the government of Canada, but according to Apollo 2020, Canada has about 1.8 million solopreneurs, which is very interesting. So now I was like, I'm curious to know how many businesses, enterprises are there in Canada, and with focus on small and medium-sized enterprises. Sometimes you may see them referred to as SEMEs. So the definition of a business, believe it or not, may vary from individual to individual, company to company, and different disciplines. So the definition we're going to be using today as we look at the various statistics is the definition that I got from the Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada. Their definition of a business is based upon the number of paid employees, okay? They did not include self-employment or interdeterminate in the statistics I'm going to be quoting to you shortly. And then these statistics are taken from the government of Canada. So as of 2019 in December, 1.23 million employer businesses were running in Canada. And of those, 1.2 million, or you could say 97.9%, were small businesses. Now, small businesses means paid employees between 1 to about 99, and then 22,905, or 1.9% of that total number I quoted earlier, were medium-sized businesses, which are defined as, you could say, 100 to 499 paid employees. And last but not least, 2,978 businesses, or you could say 0.2%, were large businesses, which are employees 500 plus and above, okay? Now, and a very interesting statistics is, some of you might be thinking, okay, that's good to know, but what's their survival rates? We know that not many businesses survive long-term. The same source from the government of Canada, specifically called Key Small Businesses Statistics 2020, says that after the third year, business survival rates in the goods producing sector was higher than in the services producing sector. So good producing sectors are industries like agriculture or construction, for instance. And then in terms of the service producing sector, those are examples are such as health or education, okay? And then after 5 years, 69.2% of businesses in the goods producing sector were still operating, compared with 66.2% of businesses in the services producing sector. Very interesting. They also found that there's a positive correlation between enterprise survival rate and initial business size, and that businesses that began operations with a large number of employees had a higher survival rate than businesses that began with a smaller number of employees. I think those are key factors to keep in mind. I invite you to track down the original document so you can see the various industries, businesses, and they're broken down in different fashions, okay? So it'll be very interesting, insightful for you to have a look at that. So now, keeping that in mind, let us talk a little bit now about work-life balance, since we have an idea about the numbers of the different classification of small businesses and medium businesses in Canada, their survival rates. Let's talk a little bit more now about this whole concept of work-life balance. I'm going to share my screen because I want to give you that imagery of a seesaw. Some of you might be like, I still don't understand how a seesaw comes into play, if you will. Think about when you talk about work-life balance, it's about juggling something, right? It's about juggling two things. So when I think about a seesaw, two things are being juggled, quote unquote juggled, but it's for fun. So I invite you to have a look at this imagery, this center imagery of a child and a father, and watch the previous episode of more comprehensive elaboration of this slide in total. Right? But for now, have a look at the positions of both parties. This child up in the air, this father closer in position, in a very interesting position. You would expect him to be at the opposite end, but he's not. So you can imagine if he were to exert his power and strength, this experience will not be pleasurable. It might be more dangerous for the child. So he did not exert his power and strength. Pun intended, keep that in mind, okay? So now we're going to talk a little bit more about the appraisal tool, the appraisal plank, I should say, framework. This model of the appraisal plank came to my knowledge as I was being certified as a hybrid program conflict resolution coach for the Canadian International Institute for Applied Negotiations. Okay. Why I like it, I think it's very apt as we talk about work-life balance in general, because, and not just work-life balance, but for any conflict resolution scenario. But it's pertinent today because when we talk about work-life balance, we're talking about the analogy of the seesaw. The seesaw, you need both parties, one should either be up or down, never horizontal. Unlike work-life balance, where we do not want work to be relegated higher or lower, or vice versa in terms of job, right? So for work-life balance, by definition, there should be a balance, equilibrium. So the appraisal plank is pertinent because it does have an imagery of a seesaw. So we're going to expand a little bit more on that. I'm going to share a busy slide, but please do not get overwhelmed. We'll talk a little bit more about it shortly. But there's another imagery that comes to mind as we talk about the appraisal plank. Now, the imagery I want you to start thinking about very shortly, you'll be wondering how on earth, what does a filtration system have to do with work-life balance, conflict, and so forth, or the appraisal plank? You're going to see that very shortly. So as I direct your gaze to this slide that I mentioned that looks a little bit busy, I want you to focus on two parts. Right here in the center, you see what looks like a seesaw. That is called the appraisal plank. So unlike the seesaw where you have at least two people, and usually you shouldn't have more than two to be safe, two occupants. On the appraisal plank, you have three occupants, which are threat, power, and uncertainty. This fulcrum here, or you could say lever, is called the subconscious fulcrum. So I mentioned earlier about a filtration system. Look up here. What do you see? You see a funnel. So something needs to go through the funnel before it drops on this appraisal plank. Depending on the nature and substance of what comes through, the object may go to the right or to the left. But bringing to the terms of conflict resolution, what is going through here are thoughts. Okay, now I mentioned the filtration system. I'm going to pause there for a second, stop sharing my screen to elaborate a little bit about this. Do you recall reading or watching documentaries about individuals, humanitarian aid going to the third world country, donating filtration systems for areas that do not have clean and safe water? Perhaps you have, or you might recall that. Why is that? Well, obviously the water is not safe for them to drink, so they need a filtration system. So there are two things that usually come to play. The individuals might trek for miles to get water, and by the time they get to the water location, it may or may not be pure. Or they might have water close to them, but it's still not clean, hence the filtration system. The filtration system filters out impurities from the water that's usually impure, filters it so that pure, or at least close to pure, drinking water is available. It is no different in our thought processes when a conflict situation might arise. And what is conflict? It's usually a difference in opinions or values, either about a topic or about delegation or about allocation. You know what I mean, okay? So let's have a look at that filtration system and the whole appraisal plank once again to talk about how this will be of value and important as we talk about work-life balance as it pertains to business owners shortly, okay? So here we go. So filtration systems. So I mentioned thoughts have to go through this funnel, aka filtration system, and it has to land on the appraisal plank. Threats, power, and uncertainty are the occupants on this. Depending on the nature of your thoughts, if they're pure, if they're biased in terms of the conflict at hand, one or both parties might resolve that conflict either in a positive term, here's this green, think of green as in solving, green means go, positive, or negatively, red means negative, stop, soothing. So depending on the nature of the thoughts, whether biased or pure or distorted, it has to land on this plank and this forum. When we talk about subconscious forum, you might think of concepts like unconscious biases. That will tilt this plank either to the left for the positive measures of trying to solve it. So it could be having power with the individual you have a conflict with. You want to prevent it, you want to de-escalate it, you want to extinguish the conflict in a positive rapport manner. Or if it falls to the negative, depending on the threats and the uncertainty involved, it might fall to the right. And one party or both might use their power over the individual or escalate this conflict. And if they tend to extinguish it, it may not be in a positive term. It will be negatively, whereby a negative rapport, because either or both parties don't see to eye, or they just don't want to solve that problem. Okay, so I stopped sharing my screen. Now recall I mentioned when I specifically raised or showed you the slides, the imagery of the father and son or child, I mentioned mark the position where the father was. The father was closer in position to the child. He was not at the far end of his end of the seesaw. In the same token, when there's a conflict situation, when you use your power and strength, do you use it in a fashion whereby you want to come close to the person to solve it, hopefully to have a win-win? Later on, we'll have an analogy, a scenario whereby we'll dissect this whole concepts of the occupants of the appraisal plank. As the term implies, you are appraising things. And we'll talk a little bit about it a little bit further. But for now, what are we going to talk about now? We're going to might as well talk about that appraisal plank and the threats. So let's use this scenario of a solopreneur or entrepreneur. Okay, so when I mentioned different kinds of businessmen or businesswomen, and again, we're talking about work-life balance here. So these individuals chose this lifestyle for a reason. Either, yes, some might say you're ambitious, but that word ambition sometimes, depending on how it's used and the context, it can shed a very negative light in the sense people are like, oh my goodness, you're always after something. But no, maybe they chose that lifestyle, yes, because they want to have work-life balance. But the life of an entrepreneur or solopreneur is not easy. Solopreneur, like I mentioned earlier, all the responsibility falls on their shoulders. What could be an example of a threat for the life of an entrepreneur? Let's say, for example, the scenario is that the solopreneur, let's say, might be a consultant working for a client who needs their services. This client is fairly new in their infancy. The administrative setup in terms of, let's say, payroll has not been set up properly or not established. And the result is that their consultants aren't paid on time. So you might know that some clients ask consultants to submit invoices at a particular frequency, maybe the first or the 15th of each month, and that their pay cycle is every 30 days. Now, that 30 days, for some people, that's a long period of time to wait, coupled with their administrative backlog. Okay, so that could be a conflict situation arriving. Okay, so now what happens in an environment whereby there's political or economic instability? The supply and demand might go down, depending on the goods and services offered by that consultant. Remember, goods I mentioned refers to maybe agriculture or construction, and service could be health or education. These are not exhaustive lists, but just an example, okay? What happens when the supply and demand goes down? Now, and this consultant has to work with such a client or a similar client that takes a long time to pay the consultants. They have to evaluate, is it worth me spending my time working with this client? Is it worth emotional turmoil? Yes, I can work overtime with them, Yes, I could decrease my fee because this client is probably saying, you know what, we don't have much work to give you, given the whole environment, economic arena of things. this solopreneur or entrepreneur has a decision to make. Number one, should they cut their losses? Or number two, should they decrease their prices so that they can have more volume? So it will end up being sort of like a win-win, but that's not truly a win-win. That'll be more of a compromise to some extent. So that's a question the solopreneur has to decide on. Now, working overtime is not really a true work-life balance now, is it? Overtime, at this point in time, work goes higher than their quality of life. Now, is this something they can maintain long-term, or is it just for a short period of time? These are questions the solopreneur has to ask themselves. But I highly recommend that they don't make that a practice, because you cannot maintain that long-term. You're going to burn out, okay? Now, in terms of power, I alluded to that a little bit, or not so much, but in terms of power, again, talking about the different occupants on that appraisal plan. Power is this consultant in the same scenario has expertise in terms of their knowledge. Power on the part of their client is that they're the ones doing the paying. And to some extent, the client and the consultant doesn't really have more say as to when they get paid, okay? So again, in order to solve this problem, both parties need to exert your power with each other and not over each other, okay? And then what's the absurdity? The absurdity with this is that, and a threat combined to some extent, is that if the consultant was to say, you know what, pay me, but I won't continue with you in the future, they risk, there's uncertainty in the sense that what if this client gives a negative review or refuses to give any review or any referrals. So there's that a little bit of uncertainty going on with that, if they were to cut ties with this client. However, again, I ask the question, at what stake? Is it worth your emotional instability? And what I mean by that, always fretting, when am I going to be paid? Keep following up, when are you going to pay me? That's not worth it. Perhaps look for other clients that have a long-standing reputation of paying their clients when they say they'll pay, or pay them even earlier, okay? Just food for thought. Now, some of the challenges for solopreneur or entrepreneur is that with every business, given the statistics that we read or listened to earlier about survival rates, some businesses break even sooner than others. Another challenge as in being a solopreneur or entrepreneur is that if this is your regular and sole source of income, there are challenges if you're not being paid on time or you don't get enough clients, okay? So some people ask, is it worth it doing all of this? Okay, well, some of the incentives though, one has to look at incentives of being a solopreneur or an entrepreneur. Now, I didn't quite mention, I don't think I mentioned the difference between the two parties. A solopreneur, they are just satisfied doing their business, providing their services better, whether it's in good or service industry, they're happy with that. But entrepreneur, usually the intent is to scale the business, keep scaling it, either to sell it or just to keep scaling it. But for a solopreneur, that's not really their focus, okay? So some of the incentives of being a business owner in general, again, is that you have autonomy over when you take your vacation time, sick time is flexible. And to some extent, yes, I would say you can actually juggle your work-life balance depending on the composition of your household. You can juggle your work and life better that way, again, depending on how good your business is doing. So going back to a thought I didn't quite finish about the survival rates, some people ask, is it worth it with all the challenges? May I invite you to think of the analogy of a bamboo tree? You may or may not have heard of the bamboo tree, but the bamboo tree basically, I don't know if this is factual, but the moral is what I want you to focus on, okay? For the first 5 years, you do not see much growth above the surface of a bamboo tree. All growth happens underneath the surface, expanding up the roots. But once a 5-year mark hits, this bamboo shoots up. So why do I say that? If you've started a new business or you're thinking of starting one, keep that in mind. Keep the analogy of the bamboo. Be faithful, be loyal, do all the networking you can do all you can do to expand your business in terms of your expertise, intellectual partnerships, and so forth. You will reap the benefit in due time. After all, ask yourself, why did I start my business? there was a reason why you took that path to be a solopreneur or entrepreneur. There must be a reason, okay? So keep at it and you will bear fruit in due time, pun intended. Now, let me give you a little bit of a history about my business. So my business is called Shalom Eagles Wings. Why did I start this business? So first and foremost, this business was founded in 2014. Why? Because I found a gap in the healthcare system whereby I noticed that women who were at risk or were predisposed to having symptomatic uterine fibroids, they were not, or their condition wasn't detected early. So my philosophy and motto is this: early detection leads to early intervention, which leads to decreased suffering. So I started a business whereby for those who were at risk for symptomatic uterine fibroids, it was an educational business. So one-on-one consultation, made referrals if I deemed appropriate. And then I also delivered workshops to raise public awareness of uterine fibroids, okay? With time, it morphs to having two arms, a clinical and administrative arm. The administrative arm is along the lines of my doctorate of administration expertise. I have a doctorate in healthcare administration. What is that? Think of me as a doctor for your literal health administration needs. So if you need any assistance services as it pertains to things like strategic management, before you create your business, after you create your business, quality improvement, change management, the list goes on, I'll be happy to help you with that, okay? So my business, Shalom Eagles Wings, I look at it as threefold: consultation, advocacy, and empowerment. So I talked a little bit about what the consultation involves. I'll tell you a little bit more about the advocacy, but it's much more along the lines of I'm always looking at innovative healthcare models to better the health of populations, okay, either in my province, nation, globally. And I'll show you a little bit more about that when we talk about call to actions. And in terms of empowerment, coaching, I provide and offer conflict resolution coaching. I am very thankful to this platform by which I'm reaching you, which is called Win-Win Women. It's the Global Women Movement. I invite you to visit their website to learn much more about the Win-Win Women. So through this platform, I'm able to hear coach, mentor women globally through my various episodes. So thank you again, Win-Win Women, for that opportunity and seeking me out for something like this. Thank you. So now, call to action. What are your call to actions? You know, I like to leave call to action steps each time. So I mentioned I was going to share an example of my advocacy efforts. So, and this is along the lines of how can we introduce models to bridge gaps in care or to close gaps in care. So I would like to invite you to have a look at my petition. So you can also find it on Google. If you were to type my name and just type petition after that, it will pop up. So basically, I have a desire and I'm looking for champions to rally with me to, number one, sign my petition. Why? Because this petition is about providing a retreat for healthcare providers, either at the front lines, administration, research, academia, who are experiencing burnout, and I'll share my screen for you to see what that looks like right now. Who are experiencing burnout is definitely gonna have evidence-based services. So this is what it looks like from change.org. It gives you the statistics of the bullying, harassment, burnout, how, talks about what the retreat hopes to achieve in terms of its outcomes, like healthy employees, enhanced client-patient outcomes, enhanced organization productivity, healthy families. And my ask is please sign and share it. You don't have to belong or be a healthcare provider to sign and share it. If you believe healthcare providers should be looked after, please sign and share. And I have other items of ask as well, okay? So on that note, I hope that you gleaned something a little bit in terms of work-life balance through the lens of a business owner, some of the challenges and incentives. And last but not least, please sign and share the petition. So on that note, I invite you to come back, same place next week, every Friday, 4 p.m. Pacific or Mountain Time, 5 p.m. for another episode of The Dancing Negotiator with Dr. Cheryl Okoli, DHA. But before you leave, I like to leave you with this thought. remember that you are needed in this world to be a solution. Be the best that you can, and do not rob the world of a precious gem, you. Goodbye, and have a splendid day.